Welcome back to Ascend Legal 101. Today we are joined by Gordon Swanson. Gordon Swanson has worked in the aviation industry for over 40 years. He holds a Transport Canada aircraft maintenance engineer license and a private pilot's license. In his 36-year career with Transport Canada, he worked as a civil aviation airworthiness inspector, district airworthiness superintendent, and as an associate director of operations. Prior to his retirement from Transport Canada, Gordon was responsible for leading the ICAO Annex 19 State Safety Program Implementation Project Team on behalf of Canada. This has given him an in-depth working knowledge and experience with the practical tools and challenges of SSP implementation. In addition, he has many years of working with the Canadian aviation industry with the implementation and maturity of safety management systems. His new venture, QSSA, or Quality and Safety Systems in Aviation, has been established to provide a specialized consulting service aimed at providing assistance to states, civil aviation authorities, and aviation and aerospace service providers in mitigating risks through implementation of state safety programs and safety management systems, and adapting and creating sustainable safety cultures. He also provides mentorship to people directly involved in influencing safety culture. Please help me welcome Gordon Swanson. So let's start with your background.
Let's see, easier said than done. I'll try to make it concise. I actually retired after 36 years of service with Transport Canada. The same organization the whole time, which is perhaps unique, although I have moved around between different locations and different roles and capacities. But to start, I worked in the industry after going to tech college, and I completed my AME license apprenticeship and got my AME license. And at the same time, I had made some money fish guiding on the coast, and I actually was able to afford to buy my private pilot license at the same time as I was going to college. So, and I did all that without student loans. So that was a good opportunity for me, and I enjoyed the salmon fishing guide experience as well. But I was working as I worked as an apprentice, obviously, and then a licensed AME for a few years, and then was working in Manitoba in a company that provided me an opportunity to be a director of maintenance and develop a maintenance program where the company had previously had all contract maintenance to a local AMO, and actually felt very successful and rewarded by compliments from the local Transport Canada inspectors out of Winnipeg. And it kind of encouraged me to think about a potential future job at Transport Canada as an airworthiness inspector. So I had actually applied, not seriously enough to be disappointed if I had been rejected, because I was assuming that based on the age of the inspectors and the experience level of the inspectors that would come to visit, that, you know, I would have to put in 10 or 15 years before actually being able to be screened in for those positions. But surprisingly enough, I was contacted for an interview in Edmonton for an airworthiness inspector position. And I was surprised, but delighted at the same time. So I took advantage of that and went for an interview and was ultimately accepted. I didn't realize it immediately at the time, but things started to fit together. Was that right at that time, and that was 1984, there was, you may recall, or others will recall, one of Canada's most significant fatal accidents, the Cranbrook Pacific Western 737 accident that hit a snowplow on the runway on landing that killed 50 people approximately. That led to the Dublin Commission into aviation safety in Canada. The recommendations from the Dublin Commission resulted in funding and hiring, as well as some major structural changes to Transport Canada. For example, the accident investigation component. CASB at that time, Civil Aviation Safety Board, was created. Today it's the Transportation Safety Board, it's multimodal. But at that time, the formation of the investigation arm, independent of influence from the regulatory arm, was created from the Mashansky report. Some other interesting creations from the Dubbin report. Some other interesting developments from Dubbin was the Civil Aviation Tribunal was formed. The enforcement branch within civil aviation was created. So there was a significant philosophical change to how Transport Canada was delivering the regulatory and oversight program. And with that was the interest in hiring young, experienced industry people, because when I joined, I was kind of one of the very first young industry experienced people without, say, military aviation experience or Air Force aviation experience, or Transport was hiring a lot of RCMP, Air Service Division people, all of whom had their 25-year pensions. Most were just coming to Transport to top up another 10 years to get a 35-year pension. So quite a difference in philosophy that came out of the recommendations of the Dubbin Commission. So I came in where the department was eager to have new blood, new ideas, new outlooks. And so I got a chance as a young guy with licenses, with experience, but without a lot of old boy connections with the industry, where, you know, there was a lot of special deals for special people, or extra hard on other people who they didn't get along with. And there was a lot of cronyism and whatnot that was going on. And, you know, I knew a few people in the industry, but not to the extent nor a desire to influence how I applied the regulations. So to make a long story short, I was in Edmonton for a few years, and then I went to Yellowknife as an inspector, and then I got a superintendent position in Yellowknife. And then back to Richmond in 2000, again as a maintenance manufacturing district superintendent in the Richmond office. And then after that, I got a position as the associate director of operations downtown Vancouver. And at that point, my role became more of a human resources, budget management, program management. My hands-on, you know, dealings with clients was virtually zero. So my role became much more of an administrative role and program development and steering role. And then about 4 years ago, prior to my retirement, I took on an assignment position with Ottawa, where I was leading the implementation of ICAO Annex 19 state safety program, which is kind of the regulatory equivalent to SMS for the industry. So I led a team that has developed much of the background material necessary to meet ICAO Annex 19. And Canada, like many countries, you know, the state safety program is an evolutionary process, and the framework all exists within our systems. But it's a continuous improvement sort of philosophy, and all of the framework is in place for Canada's state safety program. But that work continues after my retirement a year ago. So that's very quickly encapsulating my entry and exit after 36 years. And it's been a very enjoyable career. I have experienced kind of the full range. If you realize that in about 1983, because I think it was about a year before I started, each region was given a brand new IBM PC Junior computer, and one person was trained to utilize that computer. And if I remember right, the software was Lotus 123 to develop spreadsheets and Word Perfect. And it was literally one person managed that computer, and it was all just about that initial transition into the PC world. And I was trained in the analog world of blackboards and component cards and ledger paper and Rolodex cards and, pre-digital in every respect. So, I could relate to everyone that complained to me about being a young guy and I don't understand, because these old fellows that I was visiting and doing my visits and audits with were obviously my father's generation and beyond. A few younger people, but I was hired out of the industry as a person that was still working on the floor, and I did have some management experience, fortunately. Oops. So then I experienced that full transition through to today's modern era of digital databases that talk to each other and the interrelationships of safety data in a way that's completely different than was possible when I started. So that was a very interesting period for me to experience. And I also experienced a couple of significant milestone events, a couple personal ones, but also a couple of very public. And I just mentioned the first one is the Dublin Commission after the Cranbrook accident. The second one was the Mashansky Commission after the Dryden F-28 accident with iced up wings, crashed after takeoff. And I think that was a fatal accident of about 24, 25 people. That, of course, led to the implementation of the clean wing regulations and icing training for everyone associated with aircraft. So that, and human factors. The emphasis on human factors training and program development came out of the Mashansky report, along with hundreds of other smaller recommendations. So I benefited from those two significant public commissions that had an influence on the philosophy of the regulatory environment that we were working in. When I started, I would say that the role of an inspector was more heavily weighted towards service than regulation. And most inspectors found the easiest way of, in theory, bringing a company into compliance or an individual into compliance when there were infractions, usually informal. They talked about, oh yeah, take them out behind the woodshed and beat them up a little bit. Very little documentation. There, at that time, there was not a formal enforcement procedure because the enforcement division had just been created, but they're still developing program and policy. The tribunal hadn't been created quite yet. So the emphasis was certainly on voluntary compliance. But these two commissions certainly increase the emphasis of the inspectors to apply a firmer regulatory role while continuing to conduct their service role. And that thread today is still a challenge for many inspectors to get their head around, is how do you be, how do you support a new entrant to develop their procedures and their programs and their safety management systems in a friendly, supportive, consulting way, and then come back a week later with your regulator hat on and have to bring them into compliance using all of the leverage possible ultimately to achieve compliance. And some people can adapt quite well to those two hats that they have to wear. And I think I did relatively well, but I came in at a time when the expectations that I understood was to increase the regulatory environment and reduce the friendly service buddy-to-buddy environment, because that, I would say, would be a 80-20 split at that time, where 80% of your role was friendly and compliance was done voluntarily, if at all, but you were still friendly. And only the real hardcore compliance activities were dealt with, and that might have been 20%. But, having a 50-50 role, to be able to assist new companies, which I really enjoyed, but also to have the ability to put your gray hat on and issue notices and take enforcement action when needed, when voluntary compliance wasn't happening. It's a challenge, but I had to find that balance. But certainly the balance I had to find was heavier weighted towards the compliance, because the culture at that time had to shift, and that was kind of the training was being handed out. New inspectors were trained to be more on the side of compliance, but we still had to find that balance. So personally, there's probably two or three very significant things that I experienced that have formed my philosophy and my approach as an inspector on a kind of a personal level. First, when I was working in the industry, I worked for extremely good quality, high standards company. And I also worked for an extremely poor, low quality, don't meet the standards, cut all the corners possible company. So I had that experience, and I knew that one was right and one was wrong. And interestingly enough, it was a few years after I left the poor company that I learned a little more about why I knew it was wrong. For example, when I worked there, there was a Transport Canada audit that apparently happened. And it was all of the inspectors showing up, getting in the car with the owner and going to have lunch, coming back and talking for a while and then disappearing. And that was the extent of the audit. Only later, unfortunately, after I was hired as an inspector, I learned that I recognized faces, and the inspector that showed up that day at that company actually owned an aircraft, and that company did the maintenance for this person personally and hangared their aircraft for them personally. And that made me realize that something was very wrong with the attitude or philosophy of that inspector, and that wasn't going to be me. So that was one experience that I recall that caused me to realize, no, I need to develop my personal standard. I need to stand up to the values and ethics necessary to do the job. I need to ignore the personal interests and biases that can be developed because of that. And over the years, I've kind of maintained that position. But that is still an issue. There are still inspectors that have friends and enemies, and it's a constant challenge to have to maintain the level and fair playing field between operators and inspectors.
Can I ask you a question? And that is, and this may be a question that it's okay if you tell me, no, I can't answer that. I'd be in conflict or something like that if I answered that. You talked about a move from being a service provider or teacher, or, helping people along with compliance, to more of a regulatory or enforcement compliance view. Does Transport Canada have a policy, or, is there something that says, oh no, we're not service providers anymore. Now we're really looking at compliance, and it's all about compliance and enforcement. Like we've shifted. We're not helpers anymore. Because I've had my personal experience with people in Transport Canada, I think I've been very lucky in that, if I don't know the answer, I've always asked the question, because I have a legal background. If I don't know the answer, I need to find it. And as somebody who works for the Crown, quite frankly, it's your duty to answer that question, right? So can you tell me, was that a clear question?
Yeah, it's a clear question. The answer isn't so clear because all of the training that I have had, and it's consistent with what inspectors currently receive, is about, you go to your certification, which is the service elements. How do you certify a new operator? How do you issue an AOC, or how do you issue an AMO or a license, etc.? So that's all of the service element. And then you go to the training that has to do with the enforcement, compliance, how to write findings, how to present your case in a tribunal if you have to. So there's all those enforcement tools that you learn, but you also have all the certification and service tools. What's missing is the human psychology that's intended behind how an inspector performs. So inspectors are just left mentally to sort out, am I a guy that loves, I got a big ego and I love to, carry a big stick, right? So I'm going to be leaning heavily because that's my personal character. I love that kind of authority position. Or I'm a guy that loves to help people and I'm going to be very helpful, and I'm going to be shy because I don't want to go to court. I'm going to be shy about actually taking serious formal enforcement action because I know I'm going to get into those stressful situations. So what's missing and has always been a gap is that soft human skills, character molding, so we as inspectors or staff of the minister understand that philosophy, and then at least we've been trained in understanding how we are expected to make decisions, to move consistent across the country and every region, consistent in their emphasis, and finding that balance. That's the gap that's missing, is the soft skills in helping inspectors who have all different personalities. We're all different. We have, even though we're all pilots and AMEs for the most part and engineers, we all have our personal interests and our personal comfort areas. So that, I think, is what then allows some inspectors to be too heavily geared on the enforcement end, and others to be, in fact, too light on the enforcement end. It's because their personal characters are allowed just to simply dictate then how they act and react. So I think that answers your question. Is yes, there's training, but it is technical training towards technical procedures and checklists and how to process documents. It's not the soft skills training to mold the personalities of the inspectors to conform with whatever the vision is nationally.
Right, I see. I wondered. I just, wondered, because from time to time you run into an inspector who thinks he's the cops. And I'm legally trained. I'm like, you're not the cops.
Yeah, and that's why is that soft skill is not taught.
Right.
It's just allowed to evolve. And that's why you'll see the vast differences in the approach that inspectors will use.
Right, right.
And that's a gap. And, whether it can be filled or not, I don't know. But I haven't seen much of an evidence of an attempt to fill that gap with those soft skills.
Right, right. Well, it must be tough if you're an inspector or in enforcement. I mean, I guess you just learn as you go, but even I think in any sort of enforcement kind of training, there probably should be some sort of psychological component, because you also know, you certainly coming from a legal background, you learn to read people quite quickly and take in a lot of their tells, right, like quickly.
Right.
And it's been interesting for me coming from a different background into aviation, and then having people, what I feel is sort of the legal process, or that's the way that's going to be my perspective, because it's my personal bias, right?
Yeah.
And you're telling me that this is a legal process, or this is an enforcement progress or process, pardon me, or regulatory matter. So I go to my legal brain, and then you're just working me over. I'm like, hold on a sec. That's not how this works. If you want to litigate this, then we can do that.
Right.
But and I think that I've had, I personally know that I've had exceptional people that I've worked with in Transport Canada, because I've been able to say, hold on a sec, that's not how this is going to work today. I know you're a good cop and you're a bad cop, but I need these answers, and I can do what you want me to do if you provide that. So whatever cop stays in the room is fine with me, as long as we can work this out.
Unfortunately, not everyone can navigate those personalities as you've been capable of doing, and other people will cave in and either accept or go along with the aggressive inspector, or of course take advantage of the soft inspector to get their way as well. I do have a couple other examples. Another example of something very memorable that formed how I acted as an inspector is I was doing it wasn't a full audit, but it was an inspection that was formal enough that I was going through logbooks, and I identified some anomalies that would have required some work, such that I would have issued formal documents to make a log entry to then dictate that the director of maintenance do some research that night and resolve the issues before the aircraft could be released. And again, this is a perfect example of that dilemma about being hard-nosed or being soft and understanding. And in this case, I decided to, leave it verbally, and I'll come back next week and see how you did with it. Unfortunately, as we know, most all accidents are a sequence of events. And sometimes altering events can, in fact, cause or prevent an accident, unbeknown to anyone involved, that everything we do in life has a consequence. Sometimes that chain can be broken. The next morning, and I remember it very well, this individual wasn't a friend, but certainly a friendly professional relationship with this guy. Very fun, very lively, compliant, but needed to be coaxed sometimes, but very much safety oriented and willing. Not a bad actor at all. In any case, it was a helicopter water survey, and he stepped out of the machine to take a water sample. One skid broke through the ice, and he was killed. The same guy that I could have issued a piece of paper to cause him to either work all night or most likely work all morning and not have been on that water survey trip. And I know there's lots of reasons why my actions may or may not have had anything to do with his passing. However, I knew that I decided to go a route that, I should have issued paperwork, which probably would have caused him, because I know he's a conscientious guy. He either would have worked all night, and the items that I was going to bring to his attention were mandatory, required. They weren't in any way part of the actual accident. But I've often thought, would that have broken that chain of events that would have caused him not to take that trip, and I could have prevented his death? And it still affects me. And I don't like the fact that I made a decision that, not that it was wrong, it's just, again, that constant balance of service versus voluntary compliance versus aggressive enforcement has consequences. I don't have an answer. I just know that maybe I could have broken that chain of events. And that has stuck with me as a lesson, not to be hard-nosed, not to be hard over on compliance, but to be a little more serious about the role that I had as an inspector. So, these little experiences do in fact create a philosophy for inspectors. And it is, there's a lot of inspectors that truly have a personal commitment to do what they're doing, and their methods are formed through their experiences. And so, it's another little example of how things in life are not always just bureaucratic, and it's not always just compliance because the regs say so, that in fact there's a lot of little human decisions that go into managing safety.
That was a brilliant example, aside from the fact that it humanizes all of the bad guys. But
unfortunately, I've also had experience with some inspectors who clearly need to apply some human feelings and empathy and how they go about their business. But in any case.
So do you mind if we switch gears here and let's talk about where you're at now, and what does being an aviation and aerospace safety management practitioner and consultant mean?
Well, we all use those types of words to illustrate who we are. You know, my goal right now is that I'm still young enough and healthy enough and engaged enough that I want to continue to contribute to aviation safety management, but be more selective about the hours that I work and the commute that I drive and how many days a week that I work. And so my goal is to continue, perhaps to a greater extent, to continue with the state safety program work and ICAO Annex 19 work for an international audience for countries who may need some help and support in development of their state safety programs. I was working with some countries outside of Canada. Canada, again, was seen as a leader in state safety program implementation. So we were assisting a number of other countries in the development, in a large part due to Canada having 10 years of history in SMS development for the industry. A lot of countries have yet to implement SMS requirements, and ICAO Annex 19 also mandates the implementation of SMS within the other states. So Canada is a leader in that respect. We've had the SMS implementation experience, lessons learned, development of procedures, policies, and regulations around that. Many countries have to do that as part of their state safety program development, so it's very complex. So I'd like to continue to mentor and assist other states in their Annex 19 state safety program development. At the same time, I think there's still a real need for practical advice on how to manage SMS in the domestic industry in Canada. And I'm also very familiar with the SMS regulations and procedures. And I would like to be able to assist people without a regulatory hat on. And that's the new dynamic that I want to get away from, is this challenge between being a regulator one minute and a service provider the next minute, is that I'd be able to provide actual candid advice on how to meet the requirements without then, having any linkage to the regulatory world. The regulator can do their job, but my goal would be to help companies create compliant systems. But in many cases, I see the industry developing complex SMS because they think that's what transport wants to see, but they're too complex to actually manage on a day-to-day practical level. And I'm a practical guy. That's why I refer to myself as a practitioner, is that I've done it. I know how to do it. I can assist compliant programs, especially perhaps for small operators that don't have the resources to hire extra staff, to purchase expensive software to help manage their SMS, to actually assist in building functional tools that meet the requirements but are easily managed. And I'd like to be able to assist the industry in that. Another thing that's happening is that Canada, as we know, has mandatory regulatory SMS for airlines and AMOs that deal with heavy aircraft. But we don't have mandatory regulations for small AMOs, for flight training units, for design organizations, manufacturers. There's still a fairly large element of aviation and aerospace companies who aren't required to have an SMS. ICAO Annex 19 doesn't exclude those operators. So there's an emphasis on voluntary implementation of Annex 19 version of SMS within those operations domestically that aren't covered by CAR 107, for example. So there's going to be more and more, not pressure, but encouragement to voluntarily implement an SMS in all certificates in Canada, some of which are mandatory, but a large group of those certificates are voluntary based on ICAO Annex 19 criteria. And there's a lot of useful guidance and reference material that I'm very familiar with that right now the industry is not familiar with at all. because Transport Canada's guidance material, except for one advisory circular, all is applicable to the large operators and the large AMOs in terms of SMS. So following that material will result in complex systems that are far beyond what's necessary for a small flight training unit or a small AMO that, you know, may have a half a dozen people involved. But SMS can still provide increased safety for the small operators and how they make decisions and how they compile their data on hazards and how they deal with their hazard investigations, et cetera. And are they conducting training for safety in their organization? So there's a real need, whether the industry knows it or not yet. There's going to be an increasing need for assistance on SMS domestically, and my interest to continue with SSP internationally.
So can I quickly ask you, so that I guess have a better understanding. So operators who currently have a quality assurance program and they are not regulated, or, you know, it's not, they don't have to have an SMS. What's the difference between their sort of regular quality assurance program that they're running now and moving to a safety management system? And why do you think, what's the difference, and why do you think moving to a safety management program would benefit them to a higher degree than just running their quality assurance program now?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. Quality assurance right now by regulation is only mandatory within an AMO. It's not mandatory on the in the operations side of a company, in an air taxi and air commuter company. So it's required in an AMO, but it's not required in the ops side. But a lot of companies are kind of spreading their QA system and their internal audit processes to be more inclusive. SMS, on the other hand, is all inclusive. So all the operational components of an organization, it includes training, it includes safety promotion, it includes the need to compile data, run a hazard registry, and investigate reports on safety concerns, a non-punitive system of dealing with those reports. So SMS is much more holistic, whereas QA is specific, right? So that's where the systemic approach to aviation safety management comes in through SMS, is that it encompasses the whole organization and should even be expanded to include your vendors, your subcontractors, the people that pump your fuel and manage your baggage on the ramp. And you know, that SMS is truly intended to be covering and assessing and monitoring anyone or any other organization that has an influence on your operation as the accountable executive. So that is the biggest difference between QA and SMS, is the breadth and scope. Not necessarily the complexity. Obviously, to manage all those other components, you need some procedures, but a lot of that comes down to a company-wide safety culture where people are actually thinking of those procedures and eager to take training on safety management. And it becomes kind of an organic interest in safety versus a prescriptive time for our annual audit. Okay, everybody moans and groans and they do the annual audit. Okay, that's over. Now we don't have to worry about that anymore. No, SMS is more of a holistic cultural thing, and a lot of the practical tools involved, people realize, are for the greater good and are eager to do them. This is a very utopian world I'm painting right now, but that is a significant philosophical difference in approach to safety versus the QA, QC, which is just, you know, another test to detect failures of your system after it's already happened.
Right, right. And one is very proactive, where the other is sort of reactive.
A truly mature SMS should be proactive to anticipate or predict safety excursions and implement things to prevent that from happening. But You know, unfortunately, I have observed many SMS systems become reactive, and I don't want to bash computerized databases, but in a real nutshell, my human observation is once you store data in a database and take it away from visual sight, it becomes reactive. You analyze it, you react, you make a decision, which is the same as it always used to be. But if you lay it out visually, the events that are happening, and you can see it and touch it, it's something tangible that helps you predict, not just rely on the analysts that are analyzing data to tell you what happened. And when it's very sophisticated, what could happen based on that analytical review of the data. But when you have humans involved in day-to-day incidents and the investigations that go on after those incidents, to get it out on the table on the old analog tools, the flip charts and the sticky notes on the wall and the blackboards or whiteboards, if people still have them hanging in their operations offices, to go back to some of those practical, easily done tools actually creates a predictive environment. And that's what I've found in our digital age, is that people are still being reactive using the digital data.
True, and I believe, this is only my opinion, that data can be ignored. Whereas if you see it, whereas if you see it and are sort of interacting with it, I'm a sticky note person, and I'm a visual person. So if you I looked around my office just now to see all my big whiteboard with all my sticky notes all over it, because I lay out everything, how everything's going to go in a visual manner. And you see that a lot even in law firms, but also medical centers, where you can have a test result and it's ignored if it's digital. Yep. But if you have the paper, it comes up on a screen where you have to interact with it, then it's, you have to deal with it. So,
and I found people will brainstorm much more readily if they're in a boardroom with posters and sticky notes and flip charts than they will looking at a statistical spreadsheet.
Yes, and I've had people try to pull a lot over on me before because they have this piece or this piece or this piece, and it's, if you all are relying on one single piece of evidence, then that's fine, that but you're very myopic, where I have brought all of it together and laid it all out on a whiteboard or on a whatever and gone through all the paper, because that's my job, put it all together. And then people are kind of, whoops.
Yeah, I didn't think about that.
Yeah.
That may be my personal observation. There would be people argue with me, but so be it.
Yeah. No, I'm
a practical person, and in my consulting role and my mentoring role, I will encourage people not to overbuild it. Don't make it so complex that when you leave, the whole system collapses because you're the only person that knows actually how to enter and analyze the data and produce those reports. And that's often what I see too. There will be a safety manager change. Systems all go stagnant for a year until transport shows up and says, oh, so where are your current reports? Well, we don't have them because so-and-so quit. That's not a system. If anything, that's a hazard that should be investigated and resolved, right? So put that on your hazard registry. Our systems are too complicated and rely on one person. And without that person, all of our safety program collapses. And I've seen it time and time again.
Also, with quality assurance programs, my experience has been, one department will have it, the other ones won't, as you said. But if you have a safety management system that is of the whole, a holistic approach, exactly as you described it, then you don't have separate pieces of the organization going, well, how come they're getting all the attention? Or what about that? Or how, or a lot of the finger pointing, or even perhaps just sort of curiosity, because there is a general ignorance of what the other piece of the organization needs to do. Whereas if you have one program, everybody knows, everybody's on the same page?
That comes towards promoting that aviation culture, safety culture company-wide, and not just locking it up in an office with a safety manager as everyone else goes about their day. And the only time they see the safety manager is when they're investigating something or someone. And that's not the way a healthy SMS needs to work. It requires cultural change, and that has to start with the accountable executives and top down. I see, again, too many SMSs that run from the bottom up about 2 layers, and then that's it. It stops. That's, that then doesn't influence how, decisions are made to expand a company or expand new routes or introduce new aircraft types. All of the hazards that are associated with that decision making at the top. SMS doesn't seem to influence, in some cases, how that implementation is done when new routes or new aircraft are added, and extremely hazardous, but often done outside of the whole SMS system. Did you enter that in your hazard registry? Did anybody come up with the risks and develop any mitigations? No. We just made the corporate decision. The board of directors decided it, and that's the way we go. And then the safety managers felt left out, and then they're playing catch up, and now they have to be bad guy again to get it back under control. So that's an area that I really would like to provide the services, is for proactive companies that initially want to voluntarily comply, because right now all of the mandatory regulatory compliance is in place. There's some maturity work that has to be done. There's some support work to assist companies with auditing, but I'm not really interested in that to a great extent. Been there, done that. But to assist a new operator who's proactive, wants to voluntarily implement SMS, I'm eagerly wanting to help those people.
And so on your website, I noticed, I'm just sort of getting away generally from safety culture, because I think that that's a conversation that you and I could have for a long time.
That's a big topic.
It's a big one. That's right. But I noticed on your website, you're getting into this now, that you provide mentoring as part of the services that you provide. I'd really like to get a really good understanding of what kind of mentoring that you provide, and who are your sort of, I don't want to say target market, but I can think of a million people who need to be mentored right now. So.
Yeah, that's one of the service side of me that would like to assist free of charge for those quick little conversations where, an accountable executive, perhaps brand new to the role, was, just appointed, so to speak, and they don't understand their role. They don't understand how they're expected to interact with the company systems or the people or Transport Canada inspectors. Same thing would apply for a new person responsible for maintenance, or an operations manager, or a chief pilot. Any of the individuals in typically smaller operations who have progressed through an operational role and now find themselves in their first management decision-making role. And obviously safety management issues are going to become critical. And their dealings with Transport Canada will become critical. I just went through an assessment, and I got these findings. How should I respond? They rejected my corrective action plan. So, some of the discussions will become more complex, where then I will offer my consulting services to help develop policy. But I'd like to be able to get a quick text or a phone call or an email from accountable executives and management staff that are needing an unbiased, confidential opinion from a person who has worked in the organization for 36 years and understands how inspectors think, and understand the management structure, and understand the regulatory requirements. Because there is bluffing that happens. There will be standards that will be imposed on people as though they're regulations, and guidance material that is, threatened that we will shut you down if you don't follow it. Well, that's not regulatory, and I'd like to be able not to be countering or subverting Transport Canada's authority, because I have loyalties to compliance, so to speak. And I know that for the most part, Canada has developed regulations to actually address safety concerns. One would argue that, no, it's all just politics. Well, it's not all politics, but there are some requirements we have to harmonize with the FAA. We have to harmonize with ICAO to get international authorities. That's true. But for the most part, safety comes with complying, but that is not just a pragmatic compliance exercise. It comes with a culture of compliance. It comes with a compliant attitude and a proactive interest in aviation safety, not just raw compliance. So, we are stuck in a regulatory environment where compliance is required. So I would like to mentor people that are new, or simply people who want a new perspective or a different perspective, for a quick and simple dialogue for a few minutes without any cost and without any effort, and to build that relationship, so that a quick call to get them out of a pinch would be, I think, a very valuable and rewarding experience for me, and helpful to the people who are just starting out. And as an inspector, I always really enjoyed the success of issuing a brand new AOC or a brand new AMO to somebody that you worked with for a year or 2 years in some cases to get everything in place. It's very rewarding. And so I want to continue that sense of contributing to a new vision for a new company, and to get people to understand the importance of safety and the importance of their relationship with the regulator, because that is a fact of life, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
And I could be that unbiased go-between to help understand perhaps where the department is coming from, but also an interpretation of the requirements without the bias of trying to leverage an inspector's opinion to embed it in policy manuals or ops manuals or maintenance control manuals, because I think many people have had that experience. And I can be the neutral person to provide an interpretation of a standard or a regulation or pure guidance to make that, help the new folks navigate when they're just trying to do the right thing.
Right, or the old folks learn how to do it the new way.
Yeah, the proactive folks that don't really understand SMS and they want to convert.
Mm-hmm.
When I first started, I was still dealing with people that were, and I started when the air navigation orders, for example, the ANOs, if you remember the red booklets for the air regulations, the air navigation orders, and the engineering inspection manual, those were all the current reference material. And then a few years later, the airworthiness manual and ultimately the CARS came out, and all of those old documents that had been in existence for quite a few years. There was a tremendous amount of transitional work to help the proactive people, not just the complainers squawking about, you threw out all my old regs, what are these new requirements, and what's this CARS you guys keep talking about? There are a few years to assist people in understanding the CARS. We don't have that issue now, but now we are talking much more detailed content for SMS. As we mature, there's new concepts coming into SMS that require some assistance for people who have been deeply embedded in the system that don't understand safety performance indicators. How do I develop safety performance indicators? And there's terms that are common in the safety management world, but they're not common yet in the industry. So,
right. So the last piece of your new company is all about global mobility. And I'd like to know, number one, what is that? What service do you provide in that area, and why is it important?
It's related and it's not related. Global mobility is a term that is used in the accounting world and the taxation world, usually aimed towards corporations who want to move their people around the world. They have multiple offices in multiple countries. So the global mobility term is one that is familiar in the accounting world. But I realize that I have an interest and I have a network that can provide very experienced professional services as well in the personal taxation world, not the corporate world. And this is a gap that I've seen. And I've had a number of people come to me asking about aviation people, because airline pilots take contract work around the world. AMEs take contract work around the world. There's actually a significant amount of global income that some Canadians have. And the tax implications are obvious, but there's also tax treaties between countries to prevent Canadians from being double taxed. And then you're starting now to get into areas that are less well known, require a little more time to research and expertise to research. So I found that that's an enjoyable sideline, but it's not a sideline because of how aviation is international and how so many people are on their own to figure out the tax laws in the country where they are about to go under contract. And then how does CRA deal with that foreign income? And are there tax treaties with those countries? And it started because ICAO, because of my connections with ICAO, there is a tax treaty with ICAO. And so I started to get some questions about interpreting the tax code for ICAO staff if they were to come to Canada, and Montreal is the headquarters for ICAO. And there's a tax treaty between ICAO as a UN agency and Canada. And it articulates some exemptions, quite a lot of exemptions actually, from taxes and duties on ICAO members that are actually on contract in Montreal for 2 or 3 years. So that piqued my interest, and I realize it's an area that I can't find many other people that are consulting. There are certainly accountants. There are accountants who don't even know the phonetic alphabet, trying to communicate with airline pilots using terminologies that they don't understand. So I found that though I have to do more research to answer complex tax and financial planning questions, at least I can speak the aviation language so that people know that I can relate to them using acronyms and terminologies that are meaningful to them, and provide taxation and financial planning advice, and then through my network actually provide tax filing services as well. But I'm not licensed or authorized to actually do that myself, but I certainly can give advice, give proper information that is helpful to the aviation community that I don't find is readily available without a lot of personal research on their own. So I see it as an enjoyable. Again, it's a regulatory, so I enjoy the regulatory compliance work, and I can do it remotely. And it's something very satisfying when people find they actually are exempt from taxes. And we have to pay Canadian taxes, but in many cases, people assume they're going to have to pay taxes in the foreign to a foreign authority and then declare that again and pay Canadian taxes. But in most all cases, there's a way to get out of double taxation, and to gear that directly towards aviation people, not corporate, because many accounting firms that assist corporations, for example, to provide a compensation package for staff that want to be moved to Singapore versus London, and provide cost of living analysis and then a compensation package. Corporations are doing that, but an individual is left on their own to determine, is that a fair compensation package, or do they actually want me to quit, or do they want me to accept the London offer? But it takes a lot of detailed analysis to determine which offer I should accept. And corporations have many people that are analyzing that, but as an individual, very difficult to find people. And I've done some of that, and again, very interesting, very rewarding to be able to support the aviation industry that is obviously mobile. So I've chosen to use the global mobility term because it is a familiar term in the accounting and taxation world. And it, I think, is translated pretty easily to an aviation world as well, to articulate, what I'm trying to do. So.
And if somebody runs into a situation where they do need sort of a licensed advice, do you also connect them to accountants,
Yes, yes.
in immigration lawyers, or, that kind of thing? Or
Yes, I haven't
or
had
in the case of your packages, is this a constructive dismissal, or like an employment lawyer?
Yeah, I can give opinions myself, but that's all they are. Is I've researched the opinions, but I'm doing that through minimal consulting with my experts, because my expert network in that respect is not a free service. It's a very expensive service, equivalent to legal fee type services for expert signed written opinions, especially on taxation positions, because those official positions will then be presented to CRA or whoever and have legal authority as a CPA. But I have that in my network, so we can provide that full service.
Right.
I'm not declaring that myself, because it's outside the actual scope of my abilities as a consultant, but I'm introducing access to the aviation industry as that's initial access to do the research, and then make those connections for more professional services that come with significant fees. But again, if you want to save a lot of taxes, you do have to pay the accountants. So.
Right. I do have a couple of final questions for you. The first is, will you come back and talk to me more in depth about safety culture, developing a really good safety culture, or sort of maybe even making cultural change? I'm doing this so that I can really nail you down, because we're recording. Will you come back and talk to me more in depth about safety cultures, things like that?
Yes, I would love to talk more in depth. We've skirted around it, and I've even given some examples, but to focus on safety culture, because I personally believe that without a positive, proactive safety culture within an organization, safety management as a systems approach is purely just compliance. Without the culture, you've missed, in my opinion, the majority of the safety benefits from SMS. Is the safety cultural shift necessary to get everyone on board? So yes, I would love to spend time. I've got access to some really good reference material from ICAO, for example, on, it's human factors, it's psychology. There's a lot of interpersonal skills and soft, skills. So you can't come up with a magic list of bullets that here's what you do in order to have a positive safety culture, because that's what we all tend to do, right?
Right.
We're all pilots, technicians, we're linear thinkers, we love our checklists, we like black and white, we don't like the soft skills area. And of course, everyone in aviation is very much a linear thinker, right? There's a few of us, but we end up going to work for HR.
Right.
For the most part, the industry is very uncomfortable dealing with philosophies and concepts that aren't associated with a checklist or procedures or an SOP. So yes, I'd love to do that.
Excellent, thank you. And my last question then is, well, first, before I ask my last question, I'd like to thank you for joining me today. And I have to say, you answered so many of my questions before I even asked them. And you answered them much more eloquently than I would have approached them. So I really appreciate you doing that. That was magnificent. And my last question then is, where can we find you if we need you, Gordon?
I can be contacted through my website, QSSA.ca, as simple as that. And people are asking me, what does QSSA stand for? And it's simple: quality and safety systems in aviation. And you can add it in aerospace as well, because that's a segment that's often left out for the manufacturing capacity in Canada. So QSSA.ca, and there's a contact form that is pretty slick. It'll email me a question and I will respond.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.